Welcome back, everybody. We're going to welcome Hillary Barron from Bemidji State University to talk this afternoon in our first short session. Hillary, are you able to take the screen?
I am. Can you hear me
All
okay?
right, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm about a day away from losing my voice, so I turned my volume up really high. So hi, thank you for having me. I am Hillary Barron. I'm an assistant professor. Hold on a second, I gotta fix my screen. Okay. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Bemidji State University here in northern Minnesota. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of Minnesota, we're way up north, about 100 miles from Canada. We're also located among the three largest indigenous nations or tribal nations, and I'm a descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe right over here. So the reason that I talk about that even for a minute is because I am going to be sharing with you these ideas in cultural responsive undergraduate science education. And I think it's really important that not only do we talk about and acknowledge how our identities, impact our work, but how they drive our work as well. So the last time that I was part of a BIioTAP conference, I talked about this program that I've been developing called CRUISE, or Culturally Responsive Undergraduate Science Education. So I'm not going to go into it as much of detail as I did then, but very briefly, at the core of CRUISE is this idea that students, especially students who have been historically excluded or marginalized, should have the right to positive science experiences and the right to develop positive science identities, and that they should be able to kind of hang on to that rightful presence as they go through their time, whether it's undergraduate school or graduate school. And so to do that, these blue bubbles that you're looking at, or what I call domains, are basically pedagogical tools that we can use to try to ensure that rightful presence is something that happens in the classroom or the lab. So culturally relevant pedagogy says that we teach to the students who are in front of us, and that when we, make those intentional efforts to incorporate students' cultures, we actually foster cultural competence, high academic achievement, and sociopolitical consciousness. Social justice science issues is this idea that you intentionally include social justice in kind of all aspects of your science teaching, whether it is curriculum or pedagogy or whatever approach it is that you're using. And then funds of knowledge is this idea, and it is an education jargon kind of idea. Or education jargon term. And it's the idea that we all come to the table with these skills and practices that we have been developing over time as we kind of engage in and interact with our home communities, our professional communities, the way that we talk, influence, with each other, that influences our skills and practices. And when we can incorporate that into science teaching and learning, students are able to learn science content more deeply and also develop critical thinking skills. So this is kind of the big framework of CRUISE. But what I wanted to do before getting into an example is take you through some of the kind of major ways that teaching assistants have developed as they have engaged with CRUISE over the last several years that I've been working on this. So when I first started working to develop the program, I was working with undergraduate teaching assistants at the University of Minnesota, which is a research-intensive university. Undergraduate teaching assistants there taught non-majors mostly, and then graduate students taught the majors labs. So undergraduate teaching assistants, as they engaged in CRUISE, which always I tend to have as a semester-long professional development engagement. It's not a one-off kind of workshop. It's an ongoing kind of process. As they were engaging in what it means to be culturally responsive, they were really kind of focused in on making sure that they were developing this classroom culture of inclusivity, that students came into their labs feeling like they belonged. They were really interested in developing that. They were really motivated to feature diverse scientists to make sure that students knew that it wasn't just white men in lab coats that did science. And probably the most interesting thing for me is that they were really keen on leaning into funds of knowledge, which, as I said, it's kind of an education theoretical construct jargon kind of thing. But they latched onto it right away, and they're like, "Heck yeah, we're going to do this. We're gonna like let students know that they have skills that they bring to the table, and we're going to use it in the class." And so then, as we were working more with graduate students, finding things like graduate teaching assistants are really skilled at being able to take these big ideas in CRUISE and distill them down into practical applications and very specific applications for their own lab and their own units and whatnot. Really good at connecting real world issues and having critical conversations with students. And graduate students at the University of Minnesota also or graduate TAs also leaned into funds of knowledge and really liked the idea that we can empower students to use home knowledge to solve science problems and learn science in that way. Moving back up to northern Minnesota and working at Bemidji State University, which is a primarily undergraduate serving institution, also found that the graduate students here, the teaching assistants here, really interested in funds of knowledge as an idea and how to use it, and try to do that intentionally, interested in ideas of multiple ways of knowing, which I'll get to in a moment, and also place-based learning and place-based science education, which in northern Minnesota, that's like our whole identity up here. We're on the lake, we're in the woods, right? People come here for hunting and fishing. Graduate students come here for, those reasons. And they're taking parts of their identity and putting it into the importance of place-based teaching and learning in science in the college level. And so as I have been learning about how teaching assistants develop and engage in this work, I have been also doing various iterations of crews. So after the undergraduate teaching assistant cohort first started is when I organized the 3 domains in the way that they are. After working with the graduate teaching assistants at the University of Minnesota, really started to do some intentional scaffolding around social justice, which was a direct result of the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and helping graduate student teaching assistants think about how do we meaningfully have conversations with undergrad students, and how do we just exist in this moment in time, and bring social justice into classroom conversations. And then as I've been back in northern Minnesota, focusing on Indigenous science, because that's a huge part of my own identity as well. But one thing that has been a commonly kind of cited barrier across all TA groups is, and we've talked about this, and Sohoya was talking about this a little bit earlier as well, time is a problem. We're so content focused, especially in biology. There's not time to get through the content. How do we have time to learn a new teaching strategy? How do we have time to learn teaching in general? Autonomy is a problem, right? Teaching assistants don't often have autonomy in what gets taught and how it gets taught. And then those things factor into their self-confidence as well. So what I want to share with you, and again, I'm gonna breeze through all of these things. All of these things could take so much longer, but I wanted to share with you what I'm doing at BSU right now to try to kind of mitigate or address those kinds of commonly cited concerns or barriers that teaching assistants have, by talking about this co-developed curriculum that the graduate students and I have been working on at BSU. And so you're going to see a super abridged version of something that takes place over the course of a whole semester. Super quickly, you're going to see these images, and I just wanted to give credit to where they come from, and a shout out to the Learning in Places Network, which works to incorporate Indigenous science knowledge. And it is more K-12 based, but we can learn a lot from our K-12 counterparts. So definitely go and check that out when you have a minute. Okay, so Bemidji State University, as I said, a public regional university, mostly undergraduate serving. We have some master's programs. The biology program is one. All of this work that I'm talking about now for the next few slides has taken place in an introductory biology course that I teach. It's with a lab. This is the kind of gen bio sequence that is more ecology focused. About 120 students per semester. And then, of course, they get split out into different lab sections. And then it is majors and non-majors. So lots of students choose this as the kind of core requirement of their lab course. And then it is a requirement for our wildlife majors and our aquatic biology majors. So I have a lot of those students in the classes as well. And then the graduate teaching assistants that I'm currently working with have engaged in Cruise PD with me before. And I tend to have 2 grad students working in these labs each semester, and super fortunate to have had the same ones for a couple semesters now as they're working towards their master's degrees. So what we do is we introduce students to the idea that Western science is different from Indigenous science. And we talk about things like this image that probably is, kind of resembles a typical energy pyramid, where kind of apparently the pinnacle of it is a man, but very hierarchical, but representative of this idea that there is a nature culture divide that happens, and that in Western science, we as humans are apart from the natural world, right? And that trickles down into the way that we teach science, both at K-12 and in college, and the way that we do science as well. If you think just for a second about the National Park Service, which I love the national parks, I'm not knocking the national parks. We should have a whole conversation about how the national parks should go back to the indigenous people they stole them from. But if you take for a second the National Park Service, you go to these beautiful wild places and you spend time and you enjoy nature, and then you leave them and go back to whatever your real world or real life is. And that just fosters this really separate from nature mentality. And like I said, that's common in the way that we, exist in the world and learn and do science. In contrast, an indigenous approach is going to prioritize something called a nature culture complementarity. And humans, as part of the natural world, once we start to engage in thinking that way, we can have a more complex understanding and do more sustainable decision making. So we introduce students to that idea. And again, this is all happening over the course of a whole semester. And then we introduce them to Mayingan, who is the gray wolf in Ojibwe. The Ojibwe language is the language of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, and Mayingan is the gray wolf. And so then we talk about Mayingan as a central concept. We learn about him, talk about multiple perspectives of Mayingan, which I'm going to briefly talk with you about, and use that kind of as the pinnacle or the cornerstone of learning about ecological interactions. And then in lab, students are doing their own observations of gray wolves with ethograms and live cameras. So we talk about Mayingan from first the perspective of farmers, because we do live in northern rural Minnesota, and there's lots of farming families, and lots of our students come from farming families. And one of their big concerns is how many livestock get killed by Mayingan or gray wolves every year. That tends to be a number that is inflated. And we see as we look at kind of the data over the course of the years, it's not quite as many actually as the kind of public perception is. What that has led to is this kind of really contentious issue of whether or not gray wolves should be delisted from the endangered species list and hunted. And so in Wisconsin, a couple of years ago, they delisted, or they opened up a wolf hunt, and Mayingan was overkilled. The quota was overkilled by almost 100 wolves in less than 72 hours. So there's some issues there to deal with. Then we talk about Mayingan from a hunting perspective. So this is happening in Minnesota right now, where the Minnesota Deer Hunters Association is going around all places in Minnesota putting up these billboards saying wolves devour 54,000 fawns a year. Categorically false. That's not true at all. So the Voyagers Wolf Project, which is a research collaborative, then is combating that very, very avidly with science communication and data and research and public engagement. Then we talk about Mayingan from the perspective of GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, who actively incorporates Ojibwe perspectives into the way that they do management and conservation of the natural resources in these particular areas. For example, Waboos, the snowshoe hare, is a source of prey for Mayingan. Waboos is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and we are in, the warmest winter, or approaching the warmest fall and winter that Minnesota has ever seen, right? So lots of things to be concerned about by way of climate change, like this phenotypic mismatching thing that can happen with Waboos. Typically supposed to be white, brown in the summer. That can not happen during extreme, temperature differentials like we're seeing now. Then we talk about Mayingan from an Anishinaabe perspective. So Mayingan is a relative to us. We consider him Brother Wolf. And we consider him, a really important being, and we consider all species as relatives in Anishinaabe culture. But then we look at this kind of approach from the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, where they just flat out say, you don't manage your relatives. If Mayingan is a relative, you don't manage your relatives. You build relationships with them. So let's not have a management plan. Let's have a relationship plan. What does that look like? And how can we kind of translate that into the way that we do, natural resource conservation and preservation? Okay, so that's a whole semester crammed into 4 minutes. But I want to share with you a couple of things that are coming out of this. And again, preliminary findings. I want to put big exclamation points here because we're just analyzing the data from spring as we are going into fall. But to the point of how this is working with students, science investigations feel more accessible to them because the topic is interesting. Wolves are interesting in Minnesota. Native students or Indigenous students feel more connected because we're making an effort to incorporate Indigenous perspectives. Non-Native students are also, they appreciate multiple perspectives. graduate students, to the point of the topic at hand, as we've been having these conversations, feel or are discussing and sharing that they feel like they have more autonomy. They're not using the word agency and they're talking with me about this, but the things that they're saying are indicating they feel like they have some agency here. They feel that they know more about the topic and the pedagogy, which is huge. So I'm coming up on the end of my time, so I'm going to breeze through this and not to diminish the importance of the implications or kind of the caveats to them. But we do need to empower graduate teaching assistants to be leaders, because there's so many benefits to them from a professional development standpoint and to their students when we do that. And we can do that by making room for co-development of curriculum or pedagogical strategies. I want to say the big caveat, though, is that I understand that this is really hard to do. We are often limited in what we can do in our time, in our own autonomy. At BSU, for example, we are all on like max overload, the max amount that we're like 30 credits a semester that we're teaching right now, just because we're like understaffed and under-resourced. So these are tall order implications. I understand that for sure. And then I guess my last kind of soapbox moment of this is that if we are going to be able to do this, to empower graduate students and do co-development, then it can't be something that they have to do on top of their additional workload. We have to, make the space to pay them or make that part of what they do just in a normal kind of day to day. Okay, so I'm over by like a minute and 10 seconds. I'll say miigwech, which is Ojibwe for thank you. I don't know if people are doing Twitter. I don't know if I'm even doing Twitter, but that's there. And you can email me at any point in time if you have questions or want to chat or anything like that. And I will stop talking now and answer questions.
Thank you, Hillary. Anyone have any questions? You can add them to the chat or just speak out and take your mutes off. Hillary, is this a course that's it's a required course for your majors?
It's a required course for the majors, yes. And then I do have a lot of non-majors, because everyone has to take a lab course, and they tend to, the students who are interested in, kind of ecology will take this one.
So are your grad students have the same Native American background? So do you find that they feel more comfortable course sharing, or is this a challenge for those who do not have that perspective?
So currently the graduate students who I'm working with are not native. And so they do have kind of the same, I wouldn't say, I don't know what the right word is. They're leery because they're concerned about, doing or saying the wrong thing. So the benefit of having gone through a professional development experience with me over the course of a whole semester is that we kind of work through some of those things ahead of time. And then of course I'm, very involved in both the labs, and then I do the lectures. And so we kind of do on the spot debriefing after lab to see how things went and whatnot. But yeah, the kind of self-efficacy piece around incorporating Indigenous science knowledge is a huge leap, and very difficult to do. And so that's a part of the professional development going into this for sure.
I have a question I can ask. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm thinking about is the interaction of culturally competent instruction with the specific content that's being taught.
Mhm.
I think that I feel like that's really happening in what you're doing. Like this is specifically biology content. And I'm just wondering if you could speak more to that about how you merged the theory around cultural competence with
Mhm.
the like core biology topics that the students are learning and that the TAs have to be able to help them learn and engage with their thinking on.
Yeah, and so I will say that I think maybe this is just me, but I think that ecology tends to be a really easier place to incorporate Indigenous science knowledge, because Indigenous science is such a fantastically fantastic model that we should aspire to kind of just do all of natural sciences with. Um, And so I feel like in ecology focused topics tend to be an easier space for people to be able to get into. And so if we kind of break it down to talk about, okay, what is the kind of typical Western science content that we want students to come away with here, and then start to weave in the indigenous science knowledge as we go through that, that tends to be an easier place for people to start. I will say that also kind of to coincide with that, it's really important to make sure that people aren't seeing the indigenous science as an add-on, or seeing indigenous science is valid because Western science says this too. You know what I mean? And so it's really kind of long and intentional process of making sure that you start at a place where the content is something that the graduate students are comfortable with to begin with, and then go from there. And so wolves are just interesting in general for people here in northern Minnesota. And one of the graduate students is actually doing research with me on student learning around wolves in particular. So starting at a place where you're already very comfortable with the content, I think is the first step.
You're going to be next at 3:55, so we'll just stay on track and just take a couple of minutes to pause before you get going.